agreed or not. Welcome everybody to this session, which is an interim report on the findings from 2 studies we're doing. Before we go into this, I'd like to just introduce ourselves. So for those of you who don't know us, but I think probably most of you, you do know us. So I'm Martin Charter, and we have Tom Clark, who is based in Australia, who's working with us. Tom has a slight voice problem at the moment, so he will get involved in the discussion, and I'll present the findings of his research so far. And then we have Joanna, and Joanna will be presenting in a short while. So this is a series of projects looking at cricket gear and sustainability and also clothing. And as with always these things, we have to say thank you to Research England and their strategic priorities funding in helping us to do this. So without further ado, I'll also sort of introduce briefly Chris, who we are collaborating very closely with on the sustainability cricket gear and clothing various projects we're doing, and I'll briefly introduce the PASIC platform in a second. So over to Chris.
Thanks, Martin. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, we've been very happy and feel privileged, if you like, to be collaborating on this project with Martin. It's something that I suppose had its original kind of setting off on this path back in 2020, I suppose, was originally when we were talking to Martin and looking at the kind of sustainability around cricket in a general kind of broader sense. And since that time, we sort of honed down into the equipment and clothing side of it. And we've done, I think, quite a bit of really good work over the last 18 months or so. And Martin has certainly pulled it together in terms of concentrating very specifically on those 2 particular areas and brought in a number of experts and relevant people to help us develop the project further. So, and the platform, which is the kind of next iteration of it, the PASIC platform, is very much about trying to drive innovation and getting more kind of creative thought around, certainly around sustainable sportswear. And also then looking at the broader kind of reuse, recycling, repurposing side of it as well. So these interim findings, I think you'll find really interesting. And in a lot of ways, we were surprised by them, if I can say, the lack of information. But we'll talk some more about that. So thank you, and look forward to the webinar.
So thanks very much, Chris. So as I say, we're really happy to be collaborating with BASIS on looking specifically at cricket clothing and cricket gear. And I know Chris has interest in taking across some of the learnings into other sports categories at some stage in the future. And of course, innovation often comes from one sector, taking things from one sector into another sector. So as part of this we've driven this sort of development of the PASIC platform, and within there, we're adding resources on there, webinar recordings, and we've really started to, as I started to see emerge, starting to see some very specific product or project opportunities, which should be able to share with you at a slightly later date, particularly looking at new materials and stuff. So without further ado, we'll get into the sort of stuff of the project. So these are two reports. One really is an overview, and as sort of and the second one is more specifically on clothing that Joe will be presenting on. So really, we decided as cricket is has quite a complicated structure as a business, but it's not just a business. We found surprisingly little data in the public domain on the game overall, but also very specifically on cricket gear and the impact of sustainability. So really, following on which a number of you attended our stakeholder meeting last summer, the research, is confirming that little consideration of sustainability issues in relation to cricket gear and clothing, and this extreme lack of data in most areas. And through the work that Joe's doing, apart from this specific report, but within her PhD, we've been going through all the sort of academic searching and found actually relatively little information on sustainability in actually gear used in a lot of sports. So big data gap. So we're seeing a growth in world participation, which is obviously going to lead to a growth in demand for cricket gear and clothing and the materials aligned to it. Major changes in the game, both globally and in England and Wales, and perhaps the impact for cricket gear and clothing has not been thought through as much as maybe it could be. We know, and the sort of stuff of BASIS has been for a long time now looking at the broader infrastructure, the venues, the grounds, etc. But this area of the gear used to play the game has had much less visibility or exploration, if you like. So once we get down into the detail, we found a lack of data on supply chains, markets, and impacts. And some of these major changes and also the sustainability drivers may pave the way for some forms of sustainable innovation. And that's the area we are particularly interested in. And we, being my centre that's been working on sustainable innovation since 1995 across multiple sectors, this is sort of what we're bringing to the party. But also what we all are noticing is increased media coverage, particularly around climate change and cricket, particularly in India and Australia. And indeed, just picked up the other day, Euronews had actually featured something which is quite interesting, as a sort of, let's say, a mainstream, media player. So there's continuing growth in participation, world's number 2 sport, often forgotten. And I had to treble check this figure. I went back to it. Yes, ICC study in 2018 said there are 300 million active players over the age of 16, so that's 300 million, who are using some form of equipment to play the game. That's a lot of units of items. So projected, increase in the game in England and Wales after recent declines, and the figures we have picked up. But all of these figures, if you've got better figures than we've found, please let us know. We've found around about 300,000 playing at least once a month. And obviously a key priority of ECB has been to try and increase participation. So again, implications. So the increasing demand for cricket gear, clothing and the materials within it. What are the implications there for sustainability? But throughout the life cycle, from the sourcing of the materials right through to the end of life. And I'd say we found a huge sort of data gap, particularly in what's happening to products at the end of life. So an issue also aligning to this is the growing discussions in England and Wales over affordability for low income groups and how sustainability, how can sustainability align with that discussion? So that's sort of our comment here. So, could, if we set up more organized reuse systems for the cricket gear, could this actually help more people engage with the game, maybe a lower price, what we've identified, particularly through Lord's Taverners, is that there is collection of gear, but often that's going to third markets. So again, a big gap in knowledge in terms of, what is the extent of reuse of cricket gear within England and Wales, for example. We're aware of one model in Wales, but that's an area of research, particularly that Joe is looking into in more detail right now. So major changes in the game, the tradition versus the commercial, versus the new. How are things going to operate? Your red ball, white ball, pink ball, the 100 here, UK, the growth of T10 and T20 tournaments worldwide, and particularly also the interesting Fair Break Invitational in Dubai, which is the first sort of private women's T20 tournament. And I'll come back onto another interesting point there. So shifting the power base, India becoming increasingly important. The whole issues around sponsorship and broadcasting licenses and the structures and systems around that. Also changes in the club game in England and Wales, particularly in the higher echelons. Minor counties not being called minor counties anymore, they're called something else that I've forgotten right at this moment. But other changes. And we found little or no accessible data on the numbers of clubs, down at that granular level. Very difficult to get information, not central sources. There's, the fragmentation of all the leagues throughout the country, difficult to find a central source, and that becomes an issue if we're trying to understand the extent of the use of cricket gear and clothing in the UK, and starting to track issues like reuse, etc., etc. So financial challenges, but there is money in the game. There is support from government, but also commercial aspects of this, but also the sort of shared love of the game. That sort of, people want the game to be successful. We're seeing that maybe there are some gaps opening up to consider sustainability more at the higher levels. At this stage, most has been focused around the infrastructure of the game, but maybe there will be potentially emerging opportunities, that one can align to other issues like affordability, accessibility, etc. Thinking about the reuse. But there is, in terms of really understanding the extent of the sustainability impacts, and particularly, the post-use phase, issues, there's a need for much better data. So there are various standards in the game, as many of us know. So we have the MCC laws that cover a variety of different products, various BSI standards, and also, the emergence of the British Safety Industry Federation's ruling that PPE, associated with cricket gear, the softs, pads, etc., has now become subject to Class 2 regulations. It's still a real hot potato. A lot of questions around that, but after a lot of let's say various conversations on the supply side, there is a press release stating all of this with the British Safety Industry Federation's logo on top of it. So this has a lot of implications. We haven't got time to go into that today, but this is a big issue that will impact on many aspects of the game, if indeed it is followed through entirely as it appears to be. There are also different grades associated with Willow, and in a sense there are standards for that in a softer sense. So can different materials be used other than wood? So there has been some testing of this by the emergence of the bamboo bat prototypes. Could bamboo bats you know, be used outside of the professional game. So it's leading to a lot of questions. And what does that BSIF ruling mean for suppliers, you know, in terms of affordability? If third-party testing of softs is going to be really required by all those who place products on the market, inevitably there's going to be more costs. You know, will that then be passed on to the consumer? And what will happen to all the non-compliant products? You know, if you've got vociferous trading standards officers, you know, it means a lot of stock will just not be able to be placed on the market. So there's a lot of big issues associated with this that, you know, maybe need to, well, a lot, I'll leave it at that. I think that's another discussion, but it's a big issue. So supplies and markets, so a plethora of similar but very expensive market reports out there. So Tom's done some excellent research, bringing all his, you know, 40, 50 years of management consulting experience to assess this. But we've had very little, you know, access to market data and very little information out there. There is no industry association for cricket gear suppliers. And I've noted this from other sectors I'm involved in. This becomes an issue. In a number of sectors, you will find that they will have maybe a sustainability group that sits and where different members of that sector sit down and look at cross-cutting issues that affect them all. But for this sector, there is no such group that we've been able to find. So lack of data, also market structures, you know, distribution through retailers online. Suppliers are, you know, broadly split into global suppliers. We've then got the specialists that are often family owned. You know, we have importers, but we've also got the emergence of new craft bat makers over the last few years, and that should read bedroom brands, not some health generated initiative. But also we found the dominance of JS Wright in the supply of English willow. So they are a key player in the supply of English willow for cricket bats. And we need better data, just everywhere across all of this issue, we need better data. So in sort of moving to closing this before passing over to Joanna, you know, we have environmental impacts at all stages of the life cycle. You know, we've articulated that in our other, you know, reports and other stuff. If you look at supply chain issues, but there's a lot of unknown, you know, almost unknown unknowns, or unknown unknowns anyway, at least. Through some ballpark estimates, you know, that we've started to look at, we're predicting that maybe there's 250,000 tons per annum of post-consumer waste from cricket gear and clothing generally, but that's very much a ballpark figure, and we need better data to do this. You know, from the cricket bats, a reliance on willow from England and Kashmir because of particular qualities, particularly in England, the particular quality of the willow. Kashmir willow is slightly different, and there are issues there in terms of, in effect, you know, some concerns about mislabeling of bats that are coming in from maybe different parts of the world that have English willow and aren't English willow. And cricket is severely impacted by climate change. So drivers, climate change, net zero drivers may start to feed through from DCLG, perhaps, you know, maybe primarily hit infrastructure, but it might start to impact on products, particularly as ECB are procurers. And there are other, you know, procurers who may be affected through that. We've got the changing demographics, increased number of women and girls and kids getting involved. So key issues here, you know, in terms of sustainability response, there is no reference on the ICC website to sustainability. We had been informed that a sustainability or corporate responsibility manager had been employed, perhaps a year or 15 months ago, but they haven't been visible to us. ECB and MCC have sustainability policies, but we're looking forward to ideally publish strategies in the future. Relatively little innovation, sustainable innovation, use references to sustainable plantations, upcycled gloves, bamboo charcoal shirts, and the prototype bats, but innovation around sustainability of the gear is new. Limited reuse schemes, but also this Fair Break new initiative, the private women's tournament, is very interesting. That prime sponsor is the SDG Impact Fund. So aligning that to sustainable development goals. So we believe there's probably a lot of opportunity for R&D and new innovation in this area, but it's of course going to be dependent on technical performance and addressing stakeholder concerns. So I'll now pass across to Joe, and Joe will shout at me at the end of each PowerPoints to move each slide.
Thank you, Martin. So today I'm going to talk about cricket clothing, but I will also make reference to cricket gloves as well. Next slide, please, Martin. So firstly, I'm going to talk about materials. So the dominant material used to make cricket clothing is still virgin polyester. And polyester is a synthetic fiber, usually derived from petroleum. We have seen recycled polyester previously used in other countries for cricket shirts, such as India and Sri Lanka, but limited use so far in the UK. We have seen some material innovation from Warwickshire, and they've trialled a 50% bamboo charcoal mixed with polyester. But some of the limitations to changing the materials, especially in the white ball professional game, is that they require a polyester base to print on to maintain those really high bright colors that are required for the game. And we're finding that the material supply chain remains very opaque. There's limited information available around material or fiber country of origin. Next slide, Martin. In terms of production, we found two main methods. The first is stock production. So this tends to be the large volume orders. They're usually placed overseas in Asia, months in advance of delivery. And the second type is on-demand production, and this is smaller quantities, and these usually demand quick lead times. So the stock production has been primarily the white kit, and we found the country of origins that have been identified so far are China, India, and Bangladesh. But it's often not transparent to the customer. You know, these countries of origins are often not on websites, despite being on a physical care label. In terms of on-demand production, UK manufacturing is being used. It's usually for smaller quantities, which often then have embroidery or printed with the club's logos or players' names and initials. So there is a customization element to the supply chain that's often dealt with locally, with clubs using local printers to customize printed shirts when needed. But we have found that there's no standardized auditing tool across the sector. SEDEX has been mentioned, but it's really the responsibility of individual brands in terms of what audits they require their suppliers to have. In terms of use, no research has been found into the use phase of clothing. If we think about washing of cricket clothing, we know that it can be up to 700,000 microfibers can be released from a single load of laundry, and these have associated health risks. We also think there's an issue with stored waste. So this is cricket clothing, which is often stored in cricket bags, in attics or garages, or in cupboards when clubs have changed players or when players stop playing. There is an indication that women and girls players are often wearing men's or boys' clothing. This is due to the limited options available to them. And some have actually shared that this can affect their performance. There's a lot more research needed in terms of the main reasons why cricket clothing may get replaced. So is it grass stains, is it holes, is it fit? And we really welcome your input into this. We've also noticed that a change in club or sponsorships or sponsor names on shirts can create an increased turnover of garments, and this can become a barrier for reuse for others. And we see collection schemes such as Lord's Taverners. These accept clothing and gear which can be reused, and this kit is often sent overseas. But some of the donations that they receive into these reuse schemes are actually unused inventory. They're not necessarily always clothing that's already been used. In terms of reuse, repair and recycling, there's little research into the reuse and disposal of cricket clothing. There is a limited number of reuse schemes that exist. Of those identified, Lord's Taverners and Cricket Kindness are the two largest. But many of these items donated is actually sent overseas, and the reuse schemes depend on the clothing that's donated being in good condition, because they're unable to accept heavily used items. So it's unknown what happens to items which already have been quite used. It's unknown what happens to cricket clothing when players are finished with it. It can be assumed that it is either donated to one of these recycling schemes or to a charity shop or given to a textile recycling bank or thrown into domestic waste. But no information has been found today on the materials recycling aspect of cricket clothing. We have identified that glove repair is happening in areas of India, but there's very little evidence for repair for clothing that's been found in the UK. In terms of disposal, no data has been found on the disposal of cricket clothing. In terms of the volume of clothing overall, much of it is distributed to third markets, and this has become unmanageable. So there's a huge market in Ghana, Kantamanto market, and this receives 50 million items a week, 40% of which are considered waste. The local government picks up 70 tons of clothing waste from this market every day. Their image on the slide here is from Chile's Atacama Desert, and there's an increasing problem with clothes being dumped in areas and people not accepting responsibility for these items. And initial indications are that cricket clothing is not sorted or separated from other sectors such as fashion clothing, and therefore it's an unknown issue what or if cricket clothing contributes to this issue. We know it might be possible to recycle some of the cricket clothing. However, generally only about 1% of used clothing is recycled back into new clothing, and this is due to a number of factors, but technical barriers in the recycling process, as well as limited reverse logistics and infrastructure. So we can assume a very limited amount of cricket clothing is actually being recycled. In terms of innovation, there seems to be very limited sustainable innovation in clothing within the public domain. We have seen material innovation at Warwickshire using the 50% bamboo charcoal, and we see collection schemes for cricket gear such as Lord's Taverners and Cricket Kindness. There are examples such as the Grey Nichols gloves, which you can see here. These are an upcycled cricket glove, and these provide an opportunity for circularity. These are using offcuts which would otherwise have been considered waste. But these were banned in international televised games, but they're still being sold online. But they're being promoted as having a lower price than normal gloves. At this point, I'm going to hand back to Martin to open up for discussion.
So thank you, Joanna. Very clear. So what we have is I'd like to open a discussion, and we've got a sort of series of questions, and I think because of maybe the format, what I might do is just run through the questions, each of the questions, and then really open it for discussion or comments from the audience, you know, and then maybe I'll go back to the questions if we need some more prompts. So some of the key questions that we're looking to tackle at the moment are, you know, that we would value any thoughts or input or direction is what is the rough estimate of the size for the market for effectively cricket gear, the different items of cricket gear and clothing, either in terms of value or the number of items in England and Wales. We don't believe that's collected, you know, essentially perhaps because of this lack of a, you know, trade association or professional body. I'm sure some of the manufacturers may well have market sizes for individual items, you know, to define market share, etc. But again, any thoughts on that? what proportion of cricket gear and clothing is purchased by individuals compared to clubs? For example, what we've noted, as well as the emergence of the online shops that are now aligning themselves to different amateur, clubs, and they will provide cricket gear with club logos printed for players within that club. But what we just don't have any clue about is again, it goes back to that market structure issue. How many items are being bought directly from retailers or online by individuals? How many are coming through clubs? How many are coming through other sources? So, are you buying your shirt through the club, but then buying your white trousers from Sports Direct? So we just don't really have any information on that other than sort of individual sort of experience and comments. So what is the main growth area in the demand for cricket gear and clothing? Is there some area that we're seeing more growth and demand in terms of cricket gear and clothing? What is the estimated to be the average life of cricket gear and clothing? Dependent on the age and the level of players. Is there a trend to shorter life with lower quality products? So, I mean, there's, something around, we can sort of reasonably predict a cricket ball. There is a second life for a cricket ball. After the game, people will use it in nets for training. But then, what's the average life of a cricket glove in the amateur market? And the key issue that we've been really having to keep in a discipline, in this project is this split between the amateur game and the professional game. And the mass of the market is the amateur game. But of course, they're inextricably linked. The professional game will influence the amateur game, particularly in terms of equipment, and amateur players will see individuals being used, the sponsors' logos. So again, average age, pads, gloves. One thing that we do know, again, is that actually cricket bats are a very good example of product life extension in the circularity thinking, in that if you've got a bat and you've scored a 50 or 100, you want to keep that bat going. So there's almost this sort of technical emotional attachment to your cricket bat, which is, so there's even sort of examples of well-known, well, I don't know if they're apocryphal stories of top cricket bats who are cricket players who've are so attached to their cricket bats they actually go to bed with their cricket bats. But anyway, there is this attachment. If something works, you want to keep it going. So there is and we've seen an expansion of repair services and actually specialist refurbishers of cricket bats. So lifetime of products, any information, we've seen in bats the changing of the pressing of bats, and actually more bats breaking. You've seen more bats separating from their handles in professional games when people are trying to smash the 17th six of the innings. So where do players buy their cricket gear and clothing? Has there been a big shift towards online and away from retail? So, for example, I visited just in our town, a retailer recently that I knew and historically had supplied cricket gear, but they seem to be only supplying running gear, shirts, trainers, and they seem to have moved out of cricket gear entirely. So what are the key issues that inhibit sustainability being considered and incorporating into the design and development of cricket gear? Are any manufacturers really thinking about this, at the earliest stage of design and development? And this is a critical point because 80% of your product's environmental impact is determined at the design and development stage. So what are the inhibitions to this? How many items of cricket gear and clothing do manufacturers, clubs, players, and other stakeholders donate to schemes like the Lord's Taverners? Do we have, very specific reuse schemes in some of the ECB professional, ECB Premier Leagues, the other leagues, that we just haven't picked up or nobody's picked up. What happens to cricket clothing at the end of the first life? Does most of it go to community recycling or landfill, as Joe was illustrating there? What are the obstacles to using natural fibers and other types of polymers in cricket clothing? And what tools and resources are used by those involved in cricket gear and clothing design and development to consider sustainability issues and more specifically circulation? So there's a lot of questions there, probably more questions than answers at the moment, but we just thought we'd put this out to the group who are in attendance today. And really it's over to you guys. Would you like to? It'd be great if people could sort of step up and make some comments. Is what we have presented accurate? Are we missing things? Are there opportunities? So Harry, please, I think, can you unmute yourself?
Hiya.
Yeah.
So this is kind of purely anecdotally, but from what I've seen coaching and playing, is that there's been a shift away from buying cricket gear from your local cricket expert that has a shop, or the local sports shop that has a real expertise in especially the bats they buy in. They might know the bat maker, they go and choose the bats themselves, towards buying it either online from somewhere like, I think they're called Cricket Direct or one of those big companies, or going to somewhere like Sports World or Sports Direct. And that means that you don't get to actually like feel the equipment, you don't get the touch of a new bat, you don't get the real expertise. So I know where I live, there's a guy that has been running a cricket and hockey shop for the last however many years, and he knows all the clubs around here. He buys in the bats himself, and he gives you really good, if one bat might be better for you but costs a bit more, or costs a bit less, he'll recommend the one that costs less because he knows it's a better bat. So I think I've kind of seen a shift, and I don't know whether it's a cost thing, but especially in the kind of the older guys in the club tend to still go back to where they buy their bats from and value that expertise. But the younger kids that I coach, they tend to buy it online from somewhere, I think purely because it's cheaper, but you miss out on that real expertise. But that's purely anecdotal.
I mean, I can recognize that as somebody who played for a long time, and that also aligns. So there may be a demographic shift there, going on, online with younger groups. That's just the way they do it. The other thing that your point there picks up with, particularly, we had a conversation with one of the sort of new entrants to the market, who are producing bats, and they put a very particular emphasis on, more than I would have seen sort of 20 years ago. In line with what you're saying, you would go to them, you discuss your needs, the weight, etc., and they would customize the bats to your needs. So that's, maybe a reaction to this shift that you're suggesting. So that sort of certainly would make sense from what I've observed as well. Do we have any other comments or thoughts? Please, put your
Martin,
hand up. Yeah.
I can give, so from I suppose 40 years of playing and still playing now. My observations across a number of those questions would be, when I first started playing, obviously gear was very expensive and therefore used for as long as possible. And unsurprisingly, of course, as the game has grown and there's more demand, there's more consumption and prices have come down and gear gets used also more gear is bought more often. There's certainly, in terms of the method of purchasing, as you've said, that has moved from face-to-face to online. Again, observationally, amongst the players that I play with, and who range from 20-year-olds up to 50, 60-year-olds like myself, there's definitely a different kind of perception in the way that they look at their gear. Some of it's just purely, they wear it a few times and then dispose of it and buy something the next sort of level up. The older you are, the longer you want to keep the kit, and we're all very familiar with those people who don't change their kit ever, and you wish they would. But yeah, I think it's very much driven by the level of game that's played. So if you're playing just friendly cricket, then you probably reuse your kit a lot more often than you do if you're playing league cricket. And certainly in terms of purchasing trends, online is almost exclusively where you buy the kind of perishable type kit, if you want to call it. Probably the bats and the more specialist stuff, helmets, you would actually go to a shop to either have a look at them, try them on, whatever, footwear as well. I mean, there's another area here actually.
Sure. Can I just pick you up on that one before your second point? Is I know that in one of our conversations you also had mentioned that some of the younger players perhaps that come from have more money, and you'd observe aping the professionals having a couple of different bats, and is that something you observe? Because you're bowing down to you're still playing. I stopped a few years ago, but you mentioned that. Is that something you're seeing emerging?
Yeah, certainly. If you're playing in the Premier League, you probably would have at least two bats. For that reason, you prefer bats in different circumstances depending on conditions.
But I remember back in the past, as you're saying, you even the top Premier League players would primarily have one bat. They wouldn't have in the past two bats. So that's sort of getting interesting. Sorry to interrupt, but that was a good elaboration on your point.
And handcrafted is certainly an area that's become much bigger. People making bats, having bats made.
But no, sorry, you're the next point. Sorry, interrupt.
Yeah, I was going to say about training equipment, and Harry, when he was talking there about coaching, and I coach as well, and I was just thinking there is a huge amount of equipment involved in that too. So all the stuff you use to set up drills and the rest of it, and it's none of it is sustainable material. It's all plastic. Most of it comes from China. It's it's certainly an area we probably need to include in this, which you and I haven't even thought about. Really.
No, absolutely. I think our initial contact with the ECB was around the issues in the plastic cricket bats that are used for all the great youth programs that are now going on. But what happens to those plastic bats at the end of life? Is there a better are there better ways to do that? So I think again it's yet another area where there's been very, very little research done. So
Indeed.
So I noted from the chat, and again, please, if you don't want to directly say something, please put something in the chat, that Colin had also mentioned the broader, some of the broader issues to do with particularly thinking about, social issues, labor issues in the supply chain. And so within this, we certainly are looking and trying to understand more of those, the supply chain issues, particularly with the production of a lot of the gear in Asia. We've certainly found perverse supply chains in bats where the willow comes from here, the clefts are made, then they're sent to India, handles are fitted, etc., and they're shipped back. But a lot of the clothing, it appears, for example, is all in Asia. And what I'd say the observation from the various discussions we've had are there's probably good practice, there's probably middle practice, and there's the not so good practice, particularly when you're getting subcontracting of certain specific tasks out to specialists, particularly in clothing. And again, we've had divergent responses from one manufacturer saying, we've cleaned up, child labour in our supply chain, to an ex-international player saying, I visited factories and I've seen child labour. So what is clear also, compared to football developed something called the Pledge in the 1990s to tackle child labour and other related issues in the 1990s. There isn't such an initiative for cricket. So it certainly is on our agenda for these studies, and any input on that is gratefully received. But again, it's really unknown at the moment. So I've seen Will arise on the screen. Does that mean you're going to ask a question? It'd be great if you could, Will.
Not so much a question, more an observation.
Okay, great.
I mean, it strikes me, I mean, the shift in terms of retail is maybe a bit more complicated, than just sort of high street to online. I mean, it's worth remembering that there's been large trade, certainly in the UK, sort of mail order cricket equipment for many years. And actually, you can see that going back to the 30s. You look at the cricket magazines of the day, there will be adverts for equipment that could be supplied by, then mail order. And that business carried on, that business has kind of transferred online largely. But I can remember, in the 80s, sending off for catalogues from people like 3D and Remida Sports, who would sell you equipment mail order. So there's always been an element of remote purchase. I mean, the mode has changed, and maybe the proportion of the market that it represents has probably changed, but it's not as new as all that. I think what has happened, though, is that the idea of getting quality cricket kit from an average high street sports store has pretty well vanished, because those sports stores have vanished. They've become more specialized often. So in Leicestershire, where I still play and coach, we have one specialist cricket shop, based up at Loughborough, which is a destination of its own right. Most club cricketers in Leicestershire would be aware of it, and if they want to go somewhere to try, get the hands on a new bat or something, that's where you go. Same for helmets. You pretty well can't buy that stuff, on a high street, in other parts of the county. So it's a bit more complex, and I think a bit more nuanced. There is an issue about shift to online, and that's also not unrelated to the rise of these sort of so-called bedroom brands in equipment makers, because that's very much been facilitated. I think, some of this is people buying 100 bats, direct from India, on one of the e-commerce platforms, rebranding them in the bedroom, selling them on to mates or whatever. That's quite a new thing, I think, and is linked to the the shift online. But more than that, I think if we're thinking about clothing, one of the things that I think you notice increasingly is clubs aping the professional game in how they handle clothes. Personalized gear. 20 years ago, that wasn't really a thing. in the club game. Now it's absolutely ubiquitous. And of course, as soon as you start personalizing the gear, as soon as you have as soon as you have your name, or indeed a sponsor's name that might change on the gear, you radically reduce the opportunity to reuse and recycle, and you reduce the length of life. Who wants to go out onto the field when everybody else is wearing the latest club shirt, in one from 3 years ago? You just won't do that. So I think that some of those things, have changed, and probably have come at significant cost in terms of opportunities to recycle and reuse. I think the final point I would make is that there's been a big shift, and this is partly linked to the point that I think Chris made about the prices of gear. If I think back to the early days of my club cricket down in Buckinghamshire, 1980s, actually, most people used communal kit. Pads, bats. There was a team kit bag, and before you went out to bat, you'd grab a bat, stick on some pads, and off you'd go. It was, unless you were playing at a very high level in the club game, most, if you like, recreational players would not actually own. They'd own their whites and a pair of boots. They might have a bat, but often they wouldn't have much else. And I certainly myself, I played a serious level of club cricket, but I probably didn't really have a full set of my own gear until I was, I don't know, 17, 18. Now, if I look at kids who I might coach on a Friday night, age 10, 11, 12, they'll turn up with a huge great bag on their back that's probably bigger than they are, stuffed full of their own gear. Communal kit, to a large extent has vanished.
So I just picking up a couple of, so I think you're absolutely right. I think there's just another form of direct now. I remember buying stuff from Morant Sports, and even reconditioned cricket balls, actually, that I don't know if they're so ubiquitous now, but it was quite often for your own practice, maybe in your back lawn, you'd buy actually a refurbished cricket ball. So I think, there has been a tradition of individuals buying direct, and that's moved online. I agree. I think the other last point you mentioned is really essentially what you're saying is a big shift to ownership of items, particularly post 16, 17. And I similarly remember club bag, scenario. I don't know if club bag still exists. There may be a sort of differentiation by socio-demographic area, perhaps, as to the importance of shared kit versus ownership of kit. So that's yet another angle of unknowns that we're bringing up. So, that's great. Thanks for that, Will. And I think Chris had mentioned in the chat, and I think Harry had responded to that. Are there any examples of recycling, refurbishment, repurposing of equipment in other sectors that maybe we could learn from in the sense of the sort of perhaps immaturity of this within cricket, or the hidden nature of this. And I think, Harry, you mentioned perhaps you want to come on, that you'd seen systems already in ski and snowboarding.
Yeah, I think in the ski and snowboarding industry, there's quite a good, and I think it may be because the price of like a ski jacket or ski pant is quite high. There's a really big trend of people not buying new stuff, but getting like companies fixing the ski equipment for free, or taking in, the company that I posted to, the guy takes in like any used stuff, either uses the material to repatch other stuff, or repairs the stuff. So he takes off he has a partnership with Crystal Holidays, and he takes, because every season they have a new set of equipment for their season airs, he takes the last year's set of equipment, repatches over all the badges, and then sends out the gilets and jackets he gives them away for free to local schools and things like that. And I think and he does most of it. He either puts it back in his shop and sells it for kind of minimal price, or he leaves it on a rail outside of his shops. But his thing is, he's trying to get spaces in a lot of ski shops where they have someone who's good with a sewing machine. So when people come in there, they come in and get it fixed instead of coming in to buy some new stuff. That's what he does. But I'd be interested to see. I've not seen anything even similar with cricket.
No, I mean, I think some of those sorts of models are existing for certain types of clothing, but not in sportswear more generally. So yeah, I think some of, as we're going to see more, for example, and it's going to affect sports sector, there's a strong likelihood that there will be extended producer responsibility legislation coming in for clothing and textiles, and I assume that's all clothing and textiles and sports clothing, will not be excluded from that. Certainly European Commission has come out strongly saying that something will happen. I think France and Sweden already have schemes, and the Dutch will have one next year, and the UK is likely on this one to sort of follow the lead, I think. So there is going to be, more requirements on those that place the product on the market to take back and recycle or set up schemes to enable that into the future. So there are going to be external drivers, coming in 3-5 years, particularly for the clothing, that suppliers will need to think about, and that may then start to drive opportunities for models like you're suggesting there, Harry. But again, I think there are those models, but they're not in the sportswear sector. Unless others, and I see Lucy has come online. Maybe
sorry, Martin. Yeah, sorry, I'd have to step in there. Hi, so for those of you that don't know me, I'm a sportswear designer and product developer, and from a more holistic exterior view of cricket. So I've worked in sportswear now, for many years, and across lots of different categories of sports. And from the outside, cricket is really lagging behind on the sustainability front. I mean, it's almost quite a surprise, really, because there are many sportswear categories now that have been doing this for 5 to 10 years. And so the level at which cricket is at in terms of sustainability is almost just at the beginning. And like what you were just mentioning, Martin, legislation is on its way in. There are lots of boards that are going to be bringing in regulations for how you, as a brand, take responsibility and accountability for what you produce. And I think, to be honest, that is, for me, one of the biggest things in terms of how you tackle sustainability. It's now down to the brands to be the ones to take responsibility for what they're doing and educate their consumer, because a consumer only knows as much information as they can get hold of, basically. And if there's nothing online or whichever way you're going to sell it for them to actually know about, then they're none the wiser, really. And so I've been working with Lee Burns from Lacuna, and we've been really working on this and the importance of transparency. And it's really, as a brand founder, as the designer, as whatever part you are of a brand, you have to know that it is up to you to go into the factories, see who you're working with, how are they working, what are the codes of conduct, what are the conditions like, and what fabrics are you using, where are the yarns made. You really have to be the ones to take responsibility, because no one else is going to do it. So that's what we've worked really hard to do at Lacuna, and I think we're really proud to be launching soon what we're launching, and hopefully set an example for others. And then in terms of sort of fabrics and what's already out there. Obviously, sportswear has always predominantly been within the synthetics because of the properties of what synthetics can offer. And obviously, you know, there's a huge push towards recyclability and all of this, and it is coming. And it's what I'd say is that polyester, in terms of teamwear, for example, is always, it will always continue to be used, because that is the only material you can use to sublimation print for teamwear. So it will continue to be used, but it's then the way that we go on to use it in its life. So polyester, if it's kept in its pure form as a mono material, can be recycled, and we're seeing recycling systems set up that are going to start being able to recycle these.
Sorry, just to interject with a direct question that's on
Yeah.
here, which, have you come across any specialist recycling facilities for polyester in the sportswear sector at all? You know, or in the sectors you've worked in?
I know of some. It's extremely it's still quite under wraps, because the people who have developed the technologies are keeping hold of them, but it is happening, and that's exciting. It's not completely global yet, and not many, you know, brands have availability to that yet, but the technology is being developed. And further on from that, we are on the cusp also of developing recyclability for mixed fiber garments as well, which when that comes about, I mean, that will be just incredible as well. But it is really down to the brands to, go on, Martin.
I mean, the sense that I have is there's, in the UK now, there's various sort of new projects emerging around the fibers side, and also there are perhaps lessons to be learned from some of the work that's going on in the Netherlands around some of the pilot projects they're setting up within, particularly around circularity, that I picked up through other things. But anyway, that we can share these at a later date. So I know that Monica had put her hand up, but also just before that, I'd just like to pick up on that sort of transparency type of issue. I think it is, as you're saying, the drive for transparency, traceability, etc., is a big growing issue. And you do again see some sort of leadership outside this sector from companies like Mud Jeans, for example, who have videos of the workers in the supply chain. So there's some sort of our lessons that could be brought in, from other areas and sectors. So 100%, yeah. So over to you, Monica. You still there, Monica?
Yeah, sorry. I just want to say the biggest problem with cricket is also personalization and lack of understanding what's happening with supply chain. So how much work this is involved, and there's two different channels. One, personalization clothing, where we apply the numbers on the back, sponsor logo, and there's a chain which is called made to order. And when it's made to order production, you're also facing personalization, the numbers and names on the back, and those pieces of clothing they make individually. So what is happening in the market? There is a big competition expectation, not just related to the price, but also to the lead time, which have massive impact on manufacturing and put a lot of pressure on the people who work in the factory. But unfortunately, because cricket, they have limited time and they're traveling around the world, and they try to catch from one game to another. The time is very limited. So in that respect, there's a big pressure on the manufacturing chain and very lack of understanding from the customer what work is involved.
Okay, so there's something about the need to raise awareness and understanding, across all the different stakeholders. And I think that sort of issue came out in Joe's presentation and your comment, and also Will's comment about this sort of customization, even in the amateur game, the decentralized, printing on the white blanks, of clubs, and other, if you have a local sponsor, you know, if there could be developed, if there could be process developed where you could remove those the sort of sublimation printing, where you get back to the blanks, you know, that would seem to me an interesting new innovation. Whether that's technically feasible, or there are other processes that have been developed, maybe in entirely different sectors, to do things like, how do you remove, I guess it's an ink from a polymer. I mean, I'm trying to think conceptually.
So there's at the moment there's not no such a technology to remove sublimation, and also the personalization and applying logo. This is also adding a percentage to the garment which can't be recycled. So they are companies around the Europe who do recycling. Unfortunately, the process is quite complex. Logistics. I will not say process is complex. It's just the logistic to get the is complex. And the closed loop is very good idea, and is a reason why only 1% is done, because it's cost involved. Unfortunately, a lot of companies would like to do that, but when you're facing the cost, which is investment, then a lot of brands are choosing other ways. And I think everything what is happening is very good, because you guys creating the awareness and encouraging people to impact investments, because business, unfortunately, in any business, we have to have positive impact on environment, on social, and on economic. And creating awareness is the first step forward. And that's the only way as we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. But awareness of people on the end of user, really, to respect the challenges with everyone facing.
So in terms of closed loop, there, you know, there's at the moment there are inherent problems with, you know, the printing. You know, there are inherent problems with the lack of the technologies. There are inherent problems with the lack of strong drivers. So, you know, there's, you know, and costs, as you're saying, you know, it is a business, and there's challenges with costs. So I see that Will, I think, put his hand up. Are you still there,
Yeah.
Will?
Yeah. Strikes me that cutting across a number of these areas is just a lack of transparency over supply chains. I mean, I've been researching specifically sort of global value chains associated with cricket bat manufacturing, you know, and just finding out, you know, now in that context, you know, the dominant role of JS Wright as a supplier of probably 80% of the world's English willow, you know, is quite an interesting one. But actually persuading them to tell you how much they're supplying and to where, you know, is not straightforward. I think, but it's not just over questions of willow supply that there's a general lack of transparency. I think there's, in some parts of the industry, there is a willful obfuscation, actually, of origins and where product is coming from, and there's no better example than the description, you know, English willow cricket bat. You know, what is that? You know, I've seen bats made in Meerut and Jalandhar in India that will be labelled English willow cricket bats, not illegitimately, because they are made of English willow. They just happen to be made in Meerut or Jalandhar. You know, as distinct from bats that are made from English willow in England and are also described as English willow cricket bats. There's a lot of sensitivity amongst the makers in the UK about that description, actually, and when it is or isn't legitimate to describe something as a handmade English cricket bat, actually. You know, so and the reason for that is that even some of the big brands based in the UK are now making the vast bulk of their bats offshore in India, but the branding hasn't changed. you know, and the you know, the descriptions of the bats are much as they've always been. It's genuinely very hard to know, actually, you know, if you are buying from pretty well any retailer, say a Grey Nichols bat, one of the premium brands in the UK, it's impossible to tell if that was actually one of the very small number now made in Robertsbridge, you know, down in East Anglia, or actually is it part of the 95% of what they produce, which comes from Jalandhar in India. Now, how far does that matter is an interesting question. It matters to some purchasers, possibly less to others. But I think, you know, there is something quite interesting about this culture of willful obfuscation and a lack of transparency. Now, I suspect similar would be true, you know, in terms of garments. I'm less familiar with that. But I think there's a fundamental point, you know, if you want to promote sustainability, you know, one does need to have just greater transparency and openness about what's coming from where, you know, because until we have that, it's actually very difficult to think about, you know, regulatory change or standards or what other policy interventions one might make to try and shift the dial somewhat. Transparency is key.
Yeah, I mean, what you're reminding me of something that we've done this other work around accelerating sustainability in fashion, clothing and textiles is discussion around, I forget what it's called, but like geographical locators. So the idea of Harris tweed, you know, you've got a brand that's come from, you know, tweed from Harris. So it's the same sort of issue. You've got material and product from a region and having that clear. So there are again some lessons from other things. And I think, yes, what was the last point? Coming to the end of the, is I see there was another point that I wanted to respond to, but it's gone in and out of my head. So over to Lucy, because she's got a good point to make, I know.
Yeah, it was just off the back of what Will was saying, obviously, about transparency, and obviously that's really key first stage in the sustainability. Let's say we're talking about garments here. Have you got me? Hello.
I think you're clearer now. You sort of drifted off into abstraction.
All right, I'm back. Yeah, obviously transparency is key. It's the main, you know, focus of what all brands should be doing now, is providing transparency for their consumer, for themselves as well. But secondly, and Monica touched on it briefly as well, is, you know, a huge part of the carbon footprint of a garment also is the how it's used during the consumer's interaction with it and its end of life. And that is almost just as important as the initial stage of designing the product, making the product, producing it, is then how the consumer interacts with it. And like what I was linking to responsibility, brands do now have to stand up and take responsibility for the end of life of the products that they are producing, where they're going to go. And, you know, obviously up until now, products have just been made and with no decision on what might happen with it at the end of its life. And so brands need to be adjusting their business models to cater to whether it's recycling models, upcycling models, rental systems, take back systems. And this is a huge part of tackling the sustainability, is what's going to happen afterwards.
So pick up a couple of points. And the point I remember in relation to Will's was, you know, EPR legislation is going to come in, and it's, unless, you know, something strange happens, I don't see the sportswear sector being excluded for that. So manufacturers, I think, will
it's already a huge part.
It's I mean, it's already well embedded in electronics and automotive and other sectors, and now coming in fishing gear. So there are many models about how that operates, and we've sort of been.
I mean, a lot of garments already have QR codes embedded into them that are essential garment passports, so that people will track a garment's life cycle throughout, and then brands can track where they end up at the end as well.
Sure.
So that's
sure. But I mean, I guess sort of building on that, there will be a driver coming in but there are, as you're saying, there are lessons learned and approaches that have been applied in other sectors that can be taken across. But the other point is that, I mean, part of the perverse supply chain issue in the cricket bats is this quite high embedded carbon of transporting the cricket bat, the clefts of the cricket bats to India, having them finished and then shipped back again or shipped to Australia. So there is this issue, whether it's, across all the types of gear, could you start to look at more local embedded manufacturing, production consumption systems? So that's where it starts to get sort of interesting in terms of some of maybe the indigenous fibers that you could use that might be non-agricultural fibers that might be developed and used closer to market, which of course will have a stronger circularity and carbon benefits. I think that's a sort of interesting thought. I call those opportunity zones. So, and then I think the other thing, just to make the point, and I know you want to come back on the thought there, Lucy, but just the other quick point there was that I sat in on a 1,000 sample survey it was on the US looking at sustainable sneakers, and essentially what they were saying in the sort of 18 to 26, 8-year-old age group is what that age group was interested is actually they were interested in the world behind the brand, and they're actually interested also increasingly about whether the workers producing the products were being treated fairly. So there was a social dimension emerging. Now what percentage of the decision making of a product would be influenced by that? It was more aware, or what segment of the female or male cricket market may be more open to that, I think is interesting. Generally, green surveys over the site, women are greener than men. So there may be, actually women may be much more open to those sorts of messaging as well, which is interesting with the growth of the women and girls games. So Lucy, and then Will.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say the most fundamental decision making of a product is during its design phase, and so hence why it has to go back to the brands really. It's consumers, yes, are a part of a product's life, but they have to be educated upon it. And so it's down to the brands to go out and find the right manufacturers and lead the example from the inside out really.
Mm-hmm. No, good. Yeah. Excellent. And then Will, did you have a comment?
Yeah, women's cricket is something I've had quite an involvement in through my daughter, really, over the last decade or so. And clearly it's growing hugely, and that's to be welcomed for many, many reasons. But it is interesting, I think, that some of the decision making around how it's played, is quite obviously in tension with sustainability considerations. So for instance, if all you play is women's cricket, you will always play in the UK now pretty much in coloured clothing. That's true at club level. It's true at representative level. They essentially only play with a pink ball in coloured clothing. So if we're thinking about that, comparing it to the women's game, to the men's game at club level, mostly, you will be in white clothing still in most leagues, in most parts of the country. There are a few exceptions. But I do think, some of the decision making, which has all been about, if you like, driving participation and inclusion, and if you like, the commercial drive to grow the game, has probably acted against, sustainability imperatives. And there is probably an issue there to think about some of the decision making around the development of the women's game, because if anything, one could argue it's pushing towards less rather than more sustainability. Certainly, given the reliance on polyester coloured clothing with all kinds of jazzy prints on. from what I'm hearing, and obviously there are others on the call with far more knowledge about the clothing side than I have. One might question some of the thinking there. The drive to appeal to more and to promote inclusion, may actually have cut across sustainability. There's probably a need for a bit of a rethink there.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things come out of the conversation. The overall conversations is this sort of growth in ownership of kit over time, which is consumption. I think there is, and I think this is a sort of issue, Willie, you've highlighted, is the development of coloured clothing in the amateur market and specifically in the women's market, inherently producing unrecyclable clothing. In that sense, you're not allowing product to materials life extension there, particularly because there isn't the infrastructure there isn't the recycling technologies we've heard before. So I think that's yet another emerging topic, the unintended consequences, because I think we'd also picked up from one of the other manufacturers and distributors that he saw more coloured clothing. You would inevitably start to leak into the male amateur game. So I think that whole area of the printing, the colours is a big issue. So I think probably we're a little bit over. I'm sure we've all got sort of many things to do. I'd just also like to highlight the PASIC platform again, as a resource. We will put the video and recording of this up on within the webinars section, and we will, I just have to remind ourselves that this is the interim findings. So there's a lot of things emerging here that is really useful in the discussion, and we will have a final presentation in the 24th of June. But we also have other activity that's emerging that we should be able to announce sometime in the future, that's specifically looking at certain types of materials that may be applied, more sustainable materials that might be applied in cricket. So unless anybody has any specific comments, I mean, what is always useful for me in these things, and for a small group, if people will bear with me and indulge me on this, it would be great if everybody could just make a very quick short comment about one thing you just got from today's session, whether it was a positive, a negative, an observation. And I'm literally going to go down my list on my screen and ask people. So Joanna is top of the screen. So what one key thing came out for you, Joanna?
I'm really intrigued to look into Will's point in terms of, the women's game and, driving inclusion, but is that in contrast to sustainability? That's my key takeaway.
Great. And Chris?
Very similar to that. I think he's raised a brilliant point, and that's, COVID also had a big effect on the women's game, and it kind of basically put it into complete pause mode. But yeah, it's going to grow, it's going to explode, and certainly in terms of clothing, that's going to have this is a chance for us to actually approach it in a completely different way. Yeah.
And thanks, Chris. And next on the list is Lee.
Hi there. Yes, I'd echo that one, as well as maybe looking at, although I don't know if it'll make it more sustainable, it might increase durability or life cycle, maybe even looking at new ways of getting sponsorship or logos on, so you're not doing a 2-year cycle. So maybe like a netball Velcro type thing, where you can have your kit and you change out your sponsors every 2 years, like how they do that for netball. So I think all of these around extending the life of the product, but the sublimation thing in the girls' game, I think we're heading in a weird direction with that, and I'm not sure it's really come naturally from the girls themselves. So that would be an interesting thing. I wonder if there's any avenue to challenge some of that direction, given the lack of sustainability we're heading in.
Great, thanks. And then Colin?
Hi, thanks, Martin. I think probably Will's point on transparency throughout the value chain. I think if the sport is keen to make credible claims of sustainability, yeah.
Great, thank you. And then Harry?
Hi, it would be about the kind of ingrained carbon emissions that are kind of in cricket bat production, and the way that some companies kind of send the clef or make the clef for the bat in the UK and then send it to India or Pakistan, and then the bat gets made and then sent on to Australia or the UK or somewhere. I find that quite interesting, and just wonder about the overall sustainability of that and the transparency around where the willow is kind of grown and what we call it.
Great. And Katie?
Hi. I'm just actually fairly new to this. I'm working with Lee Burns at Lacuna, and actually I was completely bowled over, Martin, by your second slide that said 300, with stats of how 300,000 people playing cricket every month. And I'm passionate about, I have 2 daughters, so passionate about girls in cricket. I'm passionate about clothing. Don't know much about the kit, but definitely prepared to learn, and very interested in pursuing this and working with Lee to try and get women's clothing out there so girls can wear kit and feel comfortable in it, but also looking at sustainability is a huge part of what we're looking at. And I've worked in knitwear for a long time, so looking at all the things that are, but really interested with all the people who are on the call and points they've made. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Lillian?
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you, Martin. So I think that the key takeaway for me was the shift in consumer experience, and how the needs and wants from the customer is now focused on sort of online, cheaper materials, cheaper the quality of materials, as opposed to valuing the expertise and buying sort of handmade products. And in a way, in terms of sustainability, the shift towards sort of using cheaper materials, buying online, is that it sort of hinders the reusability of the equipment. So yeah, I was quite surprised to hear that even within the cricket sector, consumers aren't valuing sort of the handmade and the expertise.
Great. And Lucy?
Hello. I would actually, whoever just made that point, sorry, I would actually go off the back of that actually and say that I think there needs to be a bit of analysis into why cricket has gone so heavily into teamwear when it used to be, cricket is a lot of the visuals are based on a very traditional aesthetic that have been like that for many, many years. And why is that shift gone away from such beautiful, handmade, quality crafted products to essentially fast fashion? That's what teamwear is. It's fast fashion. It's how quickly can you produce on-demand products. And I think there needs to be an analysis into why that's happened, and is that actually what people want? Is that what people feel good wearing when they're playing a really high performance sport, especially global athletes? Do they want to be wearing sublimation printed polyester when they're playing a global match, as opposed to wearing a really beautifully crafted piece of clothing? So I think that's my takeaway.
No, that's great. So Monica?
Yeah, I think for me, I will follow Lucy on that, because I think, it's very well said. Made to order is like fast fashion now. The expectation is unbelievable, and we have to work towards customer expectation, because we are in this business, and this is very, very important. However, on another side, I think recycling polyester clothing is something what we're focusing on the most, and as we working on this, like lots of people working on this for quite a while, and it's quite complex. But I think more people talking about more expectations they are, then will become easier. So for my side, focusing on the closed loop and increasing the 1%, yeah, it is something what we would like to do.
Yeah, great, thank you very much. And Tom?
Again, I apologise for not having said much. I've had problems speaking for an operation, but it's been fascinating getting all of your perspectives. I've been doing research as a consultant for, as Martin said, for donkey's years, but I've never found a sector so opaque as this, and lacking information. Even basic web searches, you get hundreds of advertisements for gear, and any mention of the word market, you get I think I've counted approximately 20 market research reports costing up to $5,000 US, and they all look pretty well the same, as if there's someone in some attic somewhere gathering this data. I'd just like to find him. If I had a spare 5,000 bucks, I'll just grab one, just see what they know. But I'm sure a lot of suppliers know. But and then any academic research for anything on cricket, it's usually about health and safety or ergonomic aspects. Or for every paper on cricket, you get about 50 on cricket, the insect pest. So it was a pleasure finding a breath of fresh air, finding Will's research, and I'm so pleased to have that Will was able to come along today, and it's you know, really good to have to hear all of you today. Well, it's continuing detective work. I just want to get I think once we open the floodgates or have an incentive for people to provide information, maybe it's ultimately going to come through market demand and regulation or whatever, that they just have to. Funnily enough, I saw an article in the Raw. It was it was a couple of years ago, maybe, when there was absolute outrage that that the European Union was going to require was proposing a ban on methyl bromide used for treating wood, and they came like, all this going to affect 100,000. It's going to destroy the game in England, and a number, whether it's just made up or what, of 100,000 bat blades a year being either exported or coming and going somehow. So if anyone has got any pointers towards data of any sort, then that would be most helpful. I've been hoping to speak to you, of course, Chris, to see what ECB have in terms of its what data it has on its affiliated clubs, which would at least be a starting point. Well, thank you again for everyone for coming today.
So thank you very much, Tom, and Tom's, because of the lack of the data, Tom's starting to sort of build some interesting models, but the quality of those models will be, much better if we get better data. Really, just through all Tom's experience, we know how to build these models, but we need much better data. So really, I'm just echoing Tom's call. If you have any data or any information, please, send it on, and this will help us. So, and last but no means least, Will, if you've, have any comments and one or two things or whatever?
I mean, for me, I think there's just a sense that certainly the sports goods side of cricket is radically under-researched. Huge potential to do interesting things. But in terms of the big takeaway for me, it's it's around this need for data and transparency around origins and supply chains. Because from that we can do an awful lot in terms of thinking about how to reduce environmental impacts, but also actually questions of accessibility and inclusion. I think the final one is the tension between some of the decision making around, if you like, the commercial development of the game. Some of it with good intentions around inclusion and sustainability imperatives. I think if we're serious about sustainability, we need some of the decision makers involved to be more mindful of the perhaps sustainability consequences of some of the commercial decisions they're taking. Because at the moment, I really don't sense much awareness really of that side.
So I think everybody's commented, and I think Sean wasn't able to comment because he's on parenting duty, keeping his eye on small children rather than talking. I mean, the big takeaways for me, when there are actually reinforcements, lack of data, transparency, and barriers to circularity practices. I would say, particularly in the clothing. And particularly, I'd say the two things that came out even more strongly was, the printing issues. And actually, I suppose the thing that really jumped out to me was, Will's comment there about really inherently the, link to the growth in the women's game, clothing, equipment is going to be more colourful. So inherently, there are going to be even more challenges there, with, reuse, recycling, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to thank everybody very much for your active contribution to the discussion. And if anybody has any input or thoughts about further collaboration, please get in contact because we're very open to that. And it's an area that we are going to continue to work in. So again, thanks all very much for the excellent workshop and contributions. So looking forward to seeing you all with our sort of final conclusions and findings in a sort of 6 weeks or so. So thanks again. Hope you all have a good day.